October 1863. The Idaho Territory was still raw, untamed country. Endless forests, jagged mountains, and trails so treacherous that every journey risked death. On one of these trails, known as the Nez Percé route, a small party of men disappeared without a trace. Among them was Lloyd Magruder, a respected merchant and pack train leader. He had just completed a successful expedition to booming Montana mining camps, selling goods at prices so high they brought him a fortune in gold dust. Loaded with wealth, mules, and provisions, Magruder and his companions turned their faces homeward, unaware that not all men in their company were friends. Some harbored darker ambitions. Days later, whispers began in Lewiston. Magruder never arrived. His companions were missing too. The trail went quiet, too quiet. Then, scattered signs of violence emerged. Blood-stained ground, broken equipment, and rumors of betrayal. The fortune in gold was gone, as if swallowed by the wilderness. It wasn't long before the truth surfaced, something far more sinister than a simple robbery on the trail. The men hadn't fallen to Indians, as some first suspected. They hadn't perished in an accident. They had been murdered, ambushed by men they trusted, bludgeoned and butchered in the dark. Their bodies were discarded in remote ravines, left for wolves and winter snow. What unfolded wasn't just a crime. It was a story of betrayal, greed, and the fragile thread of justice in the lawless frontier. Because the killers weren't strangers. They were hired hands. Men Magruder had welcomed into his company for protection. Men who smiled by his campfire, then struck when the night was darkest. But this massacre would not fade into the wilderness. A close friend of Magruder, determined and relentless, would pursue the killers across hundreds of miles, through towns and cities, all the way to San Francisco. What began as a gruesome crime on a lonely trail would become one of the most remarkable early murder investigations in the American West, leading to a dramatic trial, a public hanging, and a lasting stain on frontier memory. This is the story of Lloyd Magruder and the Nez Percé Trail Massacre, a tale of fortune gained and lives lost, of trust turned to treachery, and of justice carved out of the wilderness with sheer determination. To understand the tragedy that would later befall Lloyd Magruder, we first have to understand the man himself, his roots, his character, and the life that carried him westward into the turbulent frontier. Lloyd Magruder was born in 1811 in Virginia, a land still echoing with the rhetoric of revolution and the fresh memory of the War of 1812. Though he would not be a soldier in that conflict, the ethos of resilience and independence that permeated Virginia at the time left its mark on him. He grew up in a society that valued hard work, loyalty, and reputation, qualities that would later define his standing among men on the western frontier. Details of his early family life are sparse. Like many of his generation, Magruder's life would be shaped less by the comforts of home and more by the opportunities and dangers that lay beyond. We know he had kin in Virginia, and that he came from a line of hard-working, modestly prosperous people. But it wasn't Virginia where his destiny would unfold. Like so many restless young men of his era, the call of the frontier would eventually draw him westward. By the 1850s and 1860s, Magruder had built a reputation as a merchant and pack train leader, carving out a respected place for himself in the Idaho Territory. He settled in Lewiston, a town that sat at the confluence of the Clearwater, Snake, and Salmon rivers. Lewiston was more than just another frontier settlement. It was a gateway to the rich gold strikes in Montana. It buzzed with miners, trappers, traders, and opportunists of every stripe. In that environment, a man like Magruder could make his fortune, or lose everything. Unlike many who rushed west in search of quick riches, Magruder was known as steady and pragmatic. He wasn't just gambling on striking gold in a riverbed. He saw opportunity in supply chains, in getting goods where they were needed most, and charging a premium for the effort. It was dangerous work, but it was also highly lucrative. Pack trains carrying food, tools, and whiskey to isolated mining camps could earn staggering profits, and Magruder's ability to organize and lead such expeditions earned him admiration from his peers. In Lewiston, he was regarded as a man of integrity. He was ambitious, yes, but also known to be generous, reliable, and fair in his dealings. People trusted him, no small thing in a world where fortunes were stolen as quickly as they were made. His name carried weight. His word meant something, and that reputation would play a central role in why men agreed to travel with him when he set his sights on Montana in 1863. That year, Lloyd Magruder prepared for what would be his greatest expedition, a trading mission to the booming gold fields of Bannock and Virginia City, Montana. Reports of miners pulling fortunes straight from the ground had spread like wildfire, and the demand for supplies there was insatiable. Magruder organized a pack train loaded with goods, his ticket to a small fortune if all went according to plan. But Magruder wasn't naive. The routes to Montana were treacherous, rugged wilderness trails stalked not only by wild animals, but by bandits, opportunists, and desperate men willing to kill for gold. He knew he couldn't risk the journey alone, so he hired a group of men to help guard the goods, tend the stock, and provide protection on the road. Some of these men came with solid reputations. Others, not so much. But in the chaotic swirl of frontier life, men often relied on whoever was available. To the people of Lewiston, Lloyd Magruder was the very picture of a respectable frontier merchant, a man of vision, discipline, and decency. But the most fateful decision Lloyd Magruder made in 1863 was who he chose to ride with him. When preparing his trading expedition to Montana, Magruder assembled a small party, just 5 men in total, including himself. On the frontier, smaller groups could travel faster, but they also had to place immense trust in one another. Supplies, money, and lives were all bound together. The men Magruder hired, however, were not the stalwart companions one might have hoped for. The first was Christopher "Doc" Lowry, a gambler and con man with a reputation for trouble. Lowry had drifted across mining camps, sometimes posing as a man of medicine, but more often living off sharp dealing and intimidation. He was clever, dangerous, and charismatic, a man you might share a drink with, but never leave alone with your purse. At Lowry's side was Joseph "Billy" Romaine, another drifter and petty thief. Romaine was slicker than Lowry, less outwardly threatening, but equally unscrupulous. Together, the two men had a history of shady dealings, and some in Lewiston wondered why Magruder would place his trust in them. Then there was William Page, a rougher, harder man, once connected with soldiering, but better known for brawls and brushes with the law. Page wasn't the type to betray someone on his own initiative, but under the influence of Lowry, he became a willing accomplice. The last was Frank Allen, the youngest of the group. He had no clear trade, no strong reputation, just a hanger-on who followed the lead of stronger men. Among the 4, he was perhaps the least malicious, but in the company of Lowry and Romaine, his fate and loyalties were sealed. So it was that Lloyd Magruder, a respected merchant with much to lose, set out on a perilous expedition with 4 men whose loyalties lay not with him, but with themselves. It was a gamble that would prove deadly. The year was 1863, and Idaho Territory was a place suspended between promise and peril. Law enforcement existed in name, but the reach of sheriffs and judges rarely extended into the deep mining camps and frontier trails. Justice, more often than not, was delivered by a revolver or a lynch mob. The gold rush had lured men from every corner of the country, and not all of them came with pickaxes and honest labor. Gamblers, con men, deserters, and killers drifted as easily as the prospectors. In that wilderness, a man's fortune could be made in weeks and lost in a single night. For a merchant like Lloyd Magruder, opportunity was everywhere. Miners needed food, tools, whiskey, clothing. They would pay astonishing sums for the simplest goods, because hauling them over rugged trails was nearly impossible without a trained pack train. That was Magruder's specialty. With his train of pack animals, he could deliver flour, bacon, coffee, even nails and shovels, at prices 10 or 20 times higher than in Lewiston. To him, Montana's booming camps were not just towns of mud and tents, but golden markets. So, in the summer of 1863, Magruder set out with his small band, 9 men in total, Magruder himself, his loyal partners, and the 4 hired hands, Christopher Doc Lowry, Joseph Billy Romaine, William Page, and Frank Allen. The trail was long and treacherous, winding through mountains, rivers, and vast open plains, but the prospects at the other end were dazzling. When they reached the Montana goldfields, Magruder's gamble paid off handsomely. His goods, carried by sweating mules and patient horses, were snapped up by miners flush with gold dust. Flour that might fetch a few dollars back home sold for 20, 50, even more. Whiskey was worth its weight in silver. Tools, shovels, blankets, all transformed into treasure in the frenzy of the camps. By the time Magruder packed for the return trip, he carried not only coin and dust, but also valuable animals and fresh supplies purchased with his profits. His fortune was made. But success painted a target on his back. Every man in camp knew Magruder's pack train was heavy with gold, and among his own companions, greed began to gnaw. Lowry and Romaine, the schemers, had watched Magruder's fortune grow with thinly veiled hunger. Page, rough and violent, fell easily under their sway. Even the young Allen, impressionable and weak-willed, became entangled in their whispered plotting. Around campfires and lonely stretches of trail, their loyalty eroded. What began as grumbles, Magruder's keeping all the profit, while we sweat, turned into darker thoughts. Why guard another man's wealth when they could simply take it? To Magruder, the journey home seemed like a victory lap. He had pulled off the expedition with skill, avoided ambushes and natural disasters, and was returning a richer man. He rode confidently, perhaps a little weary but proud. To him, Lowry and the others were rough men, yes, but dependable trail hands. He could not, or would not, see the storm brewing behind him. Yet cracks showed. The conversations grew hushed when he approached. Their laughter at night had an edge. At times, the 4 lingered together, away from him, muttering in low tones. The 3 trustworthy companions who had joined Magruder for the adventure sensed unease, but even they underestimated the depth of betrayal forming in the shadows. As the train wound back through the wilderness, gold hidden in saddlebags and supplies lashed to animals, the contrast could not have been starker. Around them stretched a lawless land where greed was the strongest law of all. Ahead lay Lewiston, safety, and family. Behind, in the darkness of his own camp, treachery sharpened its knife. The Idaho frontier had seen robberies, killings, and sudden disappearances before. But what was about to unfold would shock the territory like nothing else. A betrayal not by strangers or bandits on the trail, but by the very men Magruder had trusted to guard his fortune, his animals, and his life. The trail home wound through the wilds of Idaho Territory, a land of pine forests, swift rivers, and rugged mountains. By October of 1863, the nights grew long and cold. The little caravan of men and pack animals pressed steadily west, gold and supplies strapped to their saddles. To Lloyd Magruder, it was the triumphant march of a successful merchant. To 4 of his hired hands, Christopher Doc Lowry, Joseph Billy Romaine, William Page, and Frank Allen, it was an unbearable temptation. The whispers of betrayal had hardened into resolve. Lowry and Romaine, the ringleaders, had convinced Page of the plan. Take Magruder's fortune, silence the witnesses, and vanish into the frontier with wealth enough to live like kings. Allen, though young and wavering, was drawn into the conspiracy by fear as much as greed. The plan was simple, brutal, and final. One night, As the company camped along the Nez Percé Trail, the killers made their move. The forest pressed in close, shadows thick around the firelight. Magruder and his 4 loyal companions, trusted men who had stood by him for months, settled into uneasy sleep. They had no inkling that the men standing watch were not guardians, but executioners. The slaughter took place in mid-October 1863, as the group camped along the Nez Percé Trail during the return from Virginia City toward Lewiston. The weather had turned bitter, frost whitening the ground at night, and the men huddled close to their campfire for warmth. With Lloyd Magruder were his 3 trusted companions, Horace, Henry, Evans, a longtime friend and business associate, steady and dependable. Robert Chalmers, a sturdy teamster who had worked with Magruder before. William Phillips, a younger man, energetic, loyal, eager to prove himself. They had stood by Magruder through the grueling trading expedition, hauling supplies over mountains and through river valleys, now traveling home with fortune in their hands. That night, as the fire burned low, the 3 loyal men rolled into their blankets, unaware that the hired hands were preparing a massacre. The killings began in the dead of night, when sleep dulled the senses. William Phillips was attacked first. Page crept up behind him and brought a hatchet down with a sickening crack, bludgeoning his skull before the young man could stir from his bedroll. Robert Chalmers awoke at the sound and tried to rise, but Romaine was upon him. A knife slashed across his throat, the gurgle of breath and blood ending his struggle. Horace Evans fought hardest. Roused from sleep, he grappled with Lowry in the darkness, landing blows and shouting in confusion. But Page swung again, the axe handle smashing Evans's head until he collapsed lifeless on the ground. At last, only Lloyd Magruder remained. Startled awake by the commotion, he struggled to his feet. The merchant fought like a cornered lion, grappling with Romaine and Lowry at once. He shouted into the night, but the killer's blades and fists overwhelmed him. A towel was forced into his mouth, muffling his cries, while Lowry slit his throat from ear to ear. Magruder fell heavily to the ground. The man who had survived frontier wars and built a reputation of trust and honor, undone by the treachery of those he had hired to guard him. When the silence returned, 5 men were dead. Magruder and his 3 companions, along with a loyal Chinese camp helper who, though rarely mentioned in official records, is believed to have also been murdered in the attack to eliminate every witness. It was not quick, nor clean. The camp was filled with the sounds of betrayal, the thud of blows, the rasp of desperate breaths, the terrible silence that followed. By the time the killers wiped their knives, 5 men lay dead, their lifeblood seeping into the earth of the Nez Percé Trail. For a moment, the murderers stood over the carnage, breathing hard. Then, swiftly, they turned to their prize. Saddlebags were ripped open, gold dust and coin greedily gathered. Supplies, animals, weapons, all became spoils of treachery. They worked with a cold efficiency, stripping the dead of anything valuable, tossing aside what they deemed worthless. But murder is never as tidy as a thief imagines. The killers dragged the bodies from camp, struggling to hide the evidence of their crime. Some were dumped down ravines, others left beneath hastily piled rocks or brush. In the killers' minds, the wilderness itself would erase the deed. Wolves and weather would scatter the remains. By the time anyone came looking, if they came at all, there would be nothing left but bones. Yet even in their frenzy, they left traces. Blood spattered the trail, too much to conceal. Strands of hair, torn fabric, the prints of horses leading away heavier than before. All were silent witnesses to the night's horror. And more damning still was their own behavior. In the days to come, as they rode back toward Lewiston, their boasting tongues and uneasy manner would plant seeds of suspicion long before investigators laid eyes on the bloody trail. For now, though, they believed themselves victorious. 4 men against 5, and the four had triumphed. They rode on, their packs stuffed with ill-gotten wealth, convinced that fortune had favored their daring. But in truth, the wilderness does not keep secrets forever. The missing men would be noticed. The trail of blood and gold would not vanish, and the brutal treachery of Lowry, Romaine, Page, and Allen would echo across Idaho Territory as one of the most infamous massacres of the frontier. The Nez Percé Trail, once a path of commerce and promise, had become a killing ground. Trust had turned to horror, loyalty to betrayal, and the murders of Lloyd Magruder and his companions would soon set into motion a hunt, a trial, and a reckoning that no killer could escape. The mountains had gone silent after the murders, but silence never lasts long on the frontier. Men disappeared often in the wilderness, swallowed by accident, hunger, or ambush. Yet the vanishing of Lloyd Magruder and his companions in the autumn of 1863 raised alarm in Lewiston. He was no nameless drifter. He was a man of stature, a merchant known across the territory, and his absence was noticed immediately. One man in particular refused to accept the mystery quietly. Hill Beachey, a close friend and fellow merchant, was the kind of figure the frontier both needed and feared. Relentless, determined, and unwilling to let injustice stand. Beachey had shared business ventures with Magruder, had walked the same trails, and had trusted him like a brother. When weeks passed with no sign of Magruder's safe return, Beachey began asking questions. At first, the answers trickled in. Rumors in saloons, whispers in trading posts. The story emerging was troubling. Magruder's expedition had been last seen on the trail with 4 hired men: Page, Lowry, Romaine, and Allen. But only those 4 had returned. They came into Lewiston carrying a suspicious amount of wealth, yet without the pack animals, the goods, or the familiar faces of Magruder and his trusted companions. When asked where Magruder was, their explanations were vague, evasive, and never quite the same twice. Beachey's suspicions sharpened into conviction. He saw what others hesitated to say out loud. These men had not returned as survivors of hardship, but as predators fattened on the spoils of murder. But this was Idaho Territory in 1863. There was no well-oiled justice system, no established police force. Law was a fragile, newly planted thing, still struggling to grow in a soil watered more often with blood than with order. Many in Lewiston assumed the killers would simply slip away, vanish into the wider West, and be beyond the reach of any court. Beachey would not allow it. He began a personal investigation, retracing the suspect's steps, gathering testimony, and piecing together the fragments of truth. He spoke to anyone who had seen the men on the trail or in town, and slowly, a picture formed. He learned of the bloody bedding discarded along the route, of the missing animals, of the sudden wealth displayed by men who had previously been poor. These were not coincidences. They were clues, evidence of the darkest kind of betrayal. When Beachey learned the killers had fled south toward California, he acted without hesitation. He mounted his own pursuit, covering hundreds of miles across rough terrain. His determination was remarkable. This was no posse of armed vigilantes. Beachey traveled as a man of law, not vengeance, seeking to bring the killers back alive to face a trial. In an era when frontier justice often meant a noose slung over the nearest tree branch, Beachey's insistence on legal process was extraordinary. His chase led him all the way to San Francisco, a city swelling with gold rush wealth, crime, and opportunity. Amid its crowded streets and bustling docks, the killers might have thought themselves safe, hidden in the chaos of a booming metropolis. But Beachey was not deterred. He worked with local authorities, presenting the evidence he had gathered. He used persuasion, documentation, and the force of his reputation to secure cooperation. It was a bold and unprecedented move, to extradite accused murderers from California back to a raw frontier territory where formal law was still being written. Yet Beachey achieved it. The authorities agreed, and the killers, Lowry, Romaine, Page, and Allen, were arrested and placed under guard for the long journey north. When Hill Beachey finally tracked the suspects into San Francisco in late 1863, he knew he faced more than just the men themselves. He had to overcome the sheer scale of the city, tens of thousands of people pouring in from across the globe, a place where fugitives could vanish into the alleys of Chinatown or the teeming crowds along the Barbary Coast. At first, the San Francisco authorities were skeptical. Why should they risk time and resources chasing four rough men from a distant Idaho Territory? After all, Idaho had no established governor, no solid legal framework, barely any recognized courts. The law there, in the eyes of Californians, was still more rumor than institution. But Beachey came prepared. He laid out the evidence he had gathered: sworn statements, bloody remnants from the trail, testimonies of those who had seen the men arrive suddenly flush with wealth. He argued passionately that this was not just about Magruder. It was about whether criminals could slaughter men in Idaho and then strut free in California without consequence. Slowly, he won them over. What began as hesitation turned into cooperation, and arrest warrants were issued. The arrests themselves came quickly once the warrants were in hand. Christopher Lowry, Robert "Doc" Howard, James Romaine, and William Page were located in San Francisco's rough districts, each living off their share of the stolen fortune. They were spending freely, boasting to locals, and pretending their newfound wealth had come from lucky strikes in the mines. When the sheriff's men closed in, the four reacted very differently. Romaine, the younger of the group, tried to talk his way out, insisting he was a miner who had struck it rich. Lowry, older and harder, blustered and cursed, demanding to know what proof anyone had. Page turned pale and silent, shaking but offering no resistance. And Doc Howard, ironically, was the calmest of all. He raised his hands with a sneer, as though he expected this day to come. There was no violent resistance. The killers knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they immediately began to deny the accusations, spinning lies about Magruder having gone his own way or having died in some accident on the trail. Their stories conflicted and collapsed under questioning, yet they clung to denial like drowning men to driftwood. As for the gold and stolen goods, much had already been squandered in the gambling dens and saloons of San Francisco. A portion was recovered at the time of arrest: coins, jewelry, even some of Magruder's belongings recognizable to those who had known him. But the killers had been careless, flaunting their riches, and much of the stolen fortune had already melted into the city's underworld. From the time Magruder was first reported missing in Idaho to the day of the arrests in San Francisco, only a matter of weeks had passed, astonishingly swift given the distances, the era, and the absence of modern communication. The extradition process, however, stretched longer. Securing legal transfer back to Idaho required paperwork, coordination, and Beachey's unrelenting advocacy. Ultimately, within 2 months of the murders, the killers were shackled, placed under guard, and sent on the arduous return trip north. The spectacle of 4 accused murderers being hauled back into Idaho Territory electrified the frontier. Few had believed it possible, and yet, through the persistence of one man, the impossible had been made real. Killers captured not by a lynch mob, but through the machinery of law itself. Back in Lewiston, word spread quickly. The community buzzed with anticipation and unease. Would justice truly be served? Could it be, in a place where courts were young and juries inexperienced? Many remembered other crimes where killers had walked free for lack of witnesses or evidence. Others feared the men might escape custody before trial. But Hill Beachey's dogged pursuit had changed something. This was no ordinary case. It was a test of the territory itself, of whether civilization could take root in a land where the strong so often preyed on the weak. The return of the prisoners electrified the region. Crowds gathered as the accused were brought back, shackled and sullen, their bravado diminished. They had believed they could erase their crime by disposing of bodies in the wilderness. Now, they faced the eyes of a community that demanded answers. For Lloyd Magruder and his murdered companions, justice was still uncertain. Their bodies had been abandoned in the wild, their voices silenced forever. But their friend had spoken for them, louder than any cry for revenge. Hill Beachey had proved that one man's determination could bend the arc of frontier law toward accountability. The trial ahead would be fraught with drama, doubt, and danger. Witnesses had to be persuaded, evidence presented, arguments made. The killers would fight for their lives with every lie and excuse they could muster. The community itself would be tested. Could it resist the temptation of mob justice and instead allow the rule of law to prevail? The eyes of the territory were fixed on Lewiston, and in that charged atmosphere, the question loomed larger than the men in chains. Was Idaho ready to be a place where justice, not violence, would decide the fate of killers? When the four accused killers, Christopher Lowry, Robert Doc Howard, James Romaine, and William Page, were finally marched back into the Idaho Territory under heavy guard, word spread faster than wildfire. By the winter of 1863, the Magruder case had become the talk of every mining camp, trading post, and saloon. People whispered about the betrayal, the stolen gold, the blood spilled along the Nez Percé Trail. For a society teetering between civilization and lawlessness, this trial promised to be more than just the pursuit of justice. It was a test of whether the frontier could govern itself at all. The trial was held in Lewiston, Idaho Territory, then a rough but bustling settlement that served as the region's unofficial capital. The courthouse was little more than a large room, hastily prepared for the occasion, its walls bare, its benches crowded with men who had come straight from the mines or the trail. Women and children peeked in through the windows, eager to glimpse the proceedings. For many, this was the first time they had seen law in action. Out on the frontier, disputes were often settled with fists, knives, or the barrel of a gun. But here, in this raw corner of the West, people gathered to see whether justice could truly be served in the name of the slain Lloyd Magruder and his respected companions. Presiding over the Magruder murder trial was Judge Samuel C. Parks, one of the first territorial judges appointed to the Idaho Territory by President Abraham Lincoln. Parks was no stranger to the frontier, nor to the difficult task of bringing order where violence often ruled. Before his appointment, he had practiced law in Illinois, even counted Abraham Lincoln as a colleague, and carried with him the reputation of being fair-minded but firm. Lewiston, at that time, was barely more than a cluster of rough-hewn buildings and muddy streets, and yet within its limits, Judge Parks sought to establish the authority of the United States government. To him, the Magruder case wasn't merely about punishing four killers. It was about proving that law and justice could survive in the wilderness, that Idaho would not dissolve into vigilante hangings and mob violence. The prosecution leaned heavily on Hill Beachey's testimony. He described the events leading up to the arrests, the evidence he had collected, and the inconsistencies in the killers' stories. Witnesses recalled seeing the accused men in San Francisco, suddenly rich, flashing gold and spending recklessly. Others testified to the items recovered from them, belongings that clearly had been Magruder's. The defense, by contrast, was weak. With little evidence to counter the mounting proof, the accused resorted to bluster, denial, and vague claims that Magruder had gone another way. But as the days wore on, their lies unraveled. Perhaps the most chilling part of the trial came when the details of the betrayal were laid bare. It was revealed how Magruder, confident in his men, had shared food with them around the campfire only hours before they cut his throat. Testimony painted the killers not as desperate men, but as cold conspirators who plotted for weeks to rob and slaughter those who trusted them. The jury, drawn from miners and settlers who knew all too well the dangers of treachery, listened with grim faces. On the frontier, trust was currency. To betray it so utterly struck at the heart of every man and woman who had ever depended on their neighbors to survive. For weeks, the trial dominated daily life. Newspapers from San Francisco to St. Louis printed updates, calling it one of the first great criminal cases of the new Idaho Territory. The community of Lewiston, normally fractious and divided, found itself united in anticipation. Would the jury convict? Would justice prevail? Or would the killers slip through the cracks of an untested legal system? On the final day of the trial, the packed courtroom sat in silence as the verdicts were read. Guilty, 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 guilty. All 4 men convicted of murder. A cheer erupted from outside the courthouse, where hundreds had gathered to hear the outcome. Justice, it seemed, would not be denied on the Idaho frontier. After the jury returned with the verdict, the courtroom fell into a tense hush. Lowry, ever defiant, clenched his fists and spat bitterly at the jurors, muttering that frontier justice is no justice at all. Romaine, who had tried to mask his nerves with a cold facade, turned pale and dropped his head into his hands, his composure finally cracking. Page, trembling, broke into tears, insisting he had only followed orders, his pleas drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd. Allen, silent until then, sighed heavily and crossed himself, eyes fixed on the floor as though already seeing the scaffold. Around them, townsfolk whispered and exchanged glances. Justice had been spoken, yet the raw humanity of the condemned men left an uneasy weight in the room. The execution was set for March 4th, 1864. In keeping with the customs of the time, it would be a public hanging, intended not only to punish the guilty, but also to warn the living. The scaffold was erected on a hill overlooking Lewiston. On the morning of the execution, townspeople began to gather long before dawn. Miners came from miles away, some riding all night to witness history. Merchants closed their shops. Mothers brought their children. Preachers stood solemnly at the edges of the crowd. By noon, the gathering numbered in the hundreds, perhaps the largest assembly the Idaho Territory had yet seen. The 4 condemned men were led out, shackled and pale, but still defiant in their own ways. Lowry cursed the crowd, spitting venom until the last. Romaine trembled and prayed aloud, his youth laid bare in his final moments. Page, gaunt and silent, seemed resigned, while Doc Howard carried himself with eerie calm, as though determined not to give the crowd satisfaction. Each was given a chance to speak. Their words varied, denials, half-confessions, muttered apologies, but the truth was already written in blood on the trail. At the appointed signal, the trapdoors fell. 4 men dropped into silence. A hush swept over the crowd, followed by a murmur that rolled like a wave across the hillside. Justice, in its grim frontier form, had been delivered. For the Magruder family, the verdict and execution brought a measure of closure but little comfort. Lloyd Magruder, merchant, father, pioneer, was gone, as were his loyal companions. His widow and children were left with grief and the faint consolation that the law, however crude, had avenged him. Yet the case left deeper scars on the Idaho Territory. It served as a brutal reminder that trust was fragile, that wealth could turn friends into executioners, and that in a land where the law was still young, justice had to be fought for tooth and nail. But it also showed something else, that even in the raw chaos of the gold rush frontier, law could triumph over lawlessness. Through the perseverance of men like Hill Beachey and the courage of a fledgling jury, Idaho proved that it would not be ruled by blood and betrayal alone. The execution of the Magruder murderers became legend. For years afterward, old-timers would tell newcomers about the day justice came to Lewiston, about the scaffold on the hill, about how 4 killers swung together in the cold frontier wind. And always, at the heart of the tale, was Lloyd Magruder, the man whose ambition and trust cost him his life, but whose murder galvanized a territory into proving that law and order, however fragile, could stand. The Magruder Massacre was not just another bloody tale of the gold rush frontier. It left an imprint on the very foundations of Idaho's justice system. In the early 1860s, Idaho Territory was still raw, more wilderness than civilization, where disputes were often settled with pistols and rope rather than courts and juries. Yet the pursuit of justice for Lloyd Magruder showed that even on the edges of the American frontier, law could prevail over lawlessness. The case became one of Idaho's earliest high-profile trials, and it set a precedent. Crimes could not simply vanish into the endless forests and rugged trails. Criminals who thought distance or wilderness could protect them learned otherwise. The extradition of the killers from California back to Idaho was unprecedented for the young territory and signaled that justice was no longer a suggestion, but a force determined to assert itself, even across state lines. Lloyd Magruder himself became remembered not only as a successful merchant, but as a symbol of betrayal on the frontier. He was a man who had built trust, who relied on his companions for safety on the trail, only to have that trust turned against him in the most brutal way. To settlers of the time, his story became a cautionary tale. In the goldfields, danger could wear the face of a friend. His memory was etched into the very landscape. Today, the Magruder Corridor, a rugged, remote road that traces the wilderness route where he and his companions met their fate, stands as both a geographic landmark and a memorial. Stretching across the Bitterroot and Nez Percé country, it remains one of the last untouched corridors of America's wild frontier. Travelers who pass through it are reminded of the massacre that gave the land its name, and of the merchant whose ambition ended in tragedy. The legacy of the case is double-edged. On one hand, it reassured settlers that law and order had a place in Idaho Territory, even against overwhelming odds. On the other, it underscored just how fragile justice was, how easily greed, envy, and violence could unravel the bonds of community and trust. In the end, Lloyd Magruder is remembered less for the fortune he made than for the way he died. His story is retold not as a triumph of wealth, but as a parable of caution. In a land of gold dust and ambition, betrayal was as common as opportunity. And so the image lingers. Pack mules trudging along the Nez Percé Trail, saddlebags heavy with gold, campfires flickering under the Idaho night, and somewhere in the dark, men sharpening knives, plotting treachery. The wilderness swallowed Magruder's body, but it could not bury his story. His name lives on, a ghost along the corridor, a reminder that the frontier was built as much on tragedy as it was on triumph. Lloyd Magruder's story is more than just a brutal frontier crime. It's a reminder of how fragile trust was in the wilderness and how quickly greed could turn companions into killers. But it's also a story of persistence, of a friend, Hill Beachey, who refused to let murderers walk free, and of an early justice system determined to prove that even in the rough Idaho Territory, law could stretch across mountains and deserts to bring men to trial. But what do you think about the case? Can justice be served without a man like Hill Beachey? If you found this episode haunting and want to hear more forgotten frontier crimes, let me know in the comments. Which case from the Wild West should we uncover next? And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story of intrigue, disappearance, and mystery.